Hey, it's Joe West from the West Barn with
Mike Shimshack.
Today we've got Jim Scott, famous, legendary, just like, I've been doing it 30 years. When I read his discography, I was just like, wow, it was an incredible experience. He's worked on so many epic records that I have in my personal collection. He's a mixer and audio engineer and record producer. He was nominated, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, for 17 Grammys, of which he won 7, as per my research. Worked with acts like Tedeschi and Trucks, Wilco, Dixie Chicks, Tom Petty, Sting, The Rolling Stones, Crowded House, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Rage Against the Machine, Audioslave, Foo Fighters, Supernatural from Santana. 3 Grammys for that Dixie Chicks record, but it just goes on and on. All these records that I used to listen to while I was mixing to try to get something good to come out of the speakers. I didn't know it then, but they were Jim Scott records. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for finding me and having me on today. Appreciate it.
We just did a tour. He was sweet enough to tour us around his beautiful facility, Plyrz Studio in Valencia, California, which is truly, me and Mike were just, we made his screen big on the screen while we were doing the tour. But in the side, you can see Mike and I with just our mouths open the whole time. It was an insane experience. Like at 8048, it just looks like it's pushed right off the showroom floor. 2 BCM 10s. And then you leave this control room. You think that's kind of like, okay, how are you going to top that? It goes into this warehouse. It's just like Museum of Unnatural History. It's like all the best amps and the best B3 and, Mellotron stuff and just everything. And then a whole other side of isolated recording. It's just like an insane laboratory to record in. And
was not prepared for that.
We were both not prepared for it. So really, really cool. And he tells us that he still goes occasionally if he has to make records other places. And I kept thinking to myself, who in their right mind would not get their asses on a plane and go and make a record with him in a spot that he has deemed the perfect place for him to record? You'd have to be crazy to make him go to Sweden and make a record. But just a beautiful, beautiful place. So some of the records that I was looking at that you had done are just like, Dream of the Blue Turtles. That was a record that that lived in my CD player for like a year, right? And it's like, you did that record, and it's the what was the Matchbox 20 record that you did was, it's like, these are seminal records. It's not just like he worked with that artist. It's like he worked with that artist on like the thing you remember from that artist.
Wow. Wildflowers is it.
What'd you say, Mikey?
Wildflowers is it.
Yeah.
As a sonic record, that is arguably the greatest sonic record ever made. And I think if you talk to other engineers, producers, it is the one constant record that I hear over and over and over again as a masterpiece of audio.
Well, thanks. I agree with you. And, I know you guys are in Nashville, and I gotta go arm in arm with my buddy Richard Dodd on that, because Richard mixed it. I recorded it. Richard mixed it. But just the other, with so much stuff going on with the new box set and the reissue and all that kind of stuff, I had to find some stuff for Ryan, the engineer. And I found some old Tom Petty roughs on DAT from, stuff, that in part of my research, and I'm sort of a keeper, we found stuff that I had stuff that they didn't have, which was great. But, listening to a rough mix and then listening to Richard's mix of the album is like, he just let the tape fly. Richard's an incredible mixer and a great recording engineer. Yeah. And I thank him every time anybody talks about Wildflowers. I got to thank him, because he didn't smack it. He didn't ruin it. He didn't tweak it. And he was up against Rick Rubin and Tom Petty. Tom's pretty great about letting things be real. But Rick, back in that era, Rick wanted things loud, and Rick wanted things hitting hard, and wasn't afraid of like some compression and distortion, and just like, let's make this thing loud as heck. And somehow Richard was able to fight and keep Wildflowers sounding beautiful, and it is still beautiful.
The drums on that record, do you remember a lot of the details about recording them?
Yeah.
Can you tell us, because the drums are so killer, can you tell us like what that setup kind of looked like? Who was the drummer?
It was all Steve Ferroni on that record, and that was his. He auditioned to be in the band before we started that record and got the job, and they just that was it. So we were at Sound City, and Sound City is, if you've never been there, it's kind of a famous, great old crazy place, a gigantic room. Used to be a Vox amplifier factory, and wasn't ever really designed to be a recording floor. I mean, I think they tried to design the control room. They designed it so that when you walked in, you bumped your head on the big speakers. That was great design there. But Sound City was just sort of a magical place. It's just one of those places. There was no reason why it should have sounded great. It was just a warehouse, basically. Had asbestos on the floor and the classic white acoustic tile on the ceiling. But it was a giant room, giant ceiling. And you put the drums out in the middle of the room, and that's the Sound City drum sound. You could probably get the Sound City drum sound with 2 mics. But, my whole approach, and I learned from guys in the 70s, Andy Johns and Lee DiCarlo and those kind of guys that I worked with at the record plant. And, you put a 47 in the kick drum, you put 421s on the tom-toms, put U87s on the overheads and on the room, and, like a 452 on the hi-hat, as 57 on the snare drum, and then you move the mics back just far enough until you have the picture that you want. Mm-hmm. And we never moved the mics very far back from the drum set, the room mics. City drum sound. That's it. It's a combination of
you got to go back
and that room sound.
We glitched out there, and you said, and that's the drum sound. But we have to know what you said prior to that, especially with this conversation. You were saying you moved the room mics back, and then there was a gap, and then you said, and that's the sound.
That's it. You just move the drums. Depending on what kind of record you're making, you can move the room mics far enough back from the drum set until you hear the sound that you want. And if you want to make a giant rock record, you move them kind of farther back. If you want to, I think Wildflowers is a very intimate sounding record, even though it's roomy. It's a roomy drum sound, but it's intimate. That's and in those days, of course, we were on 24-track tape. So my tracking setup, I could only use like 4 tracks or 6 tracks for the drums.
Oh my goodness.
So it was kick, snare, drums. So the tom-toms, hi-hat, overheads, everything went down on a stereo pair. Kick was separate, snare was separate. And then we tried to print the room mics separately, but that was dangerous because if Mike or Tom or somebody wanted to record a harmony or a tambourine or something, the room mic's going to go. They're not going to erase the bass, they're not going to erase the, you know what I mean? It's like you only had so much real estate. And we kept it on 24 tracks right up until they put the orchestra on the orchestra, Michael Kamen's orchestra on 4 songs. So we had to break out into a B-reel for those songs. But otherwise, it's all on 24 tracks.
It's so funny because it's so arbitrary why things happen. On a record that you idolize a drum sound of, and you imagine it was a perfect storm of blah, blah, blah. And it ends up well, sometimes we had to get rid of the room mics because we weren't going to get rid of the bass. Yeah. And then you think, oh my God. And I still have this, it's just a masterpiece of recording. And it's so arbitrary at times.
Well, and also, people don't know what we had to do back in the day, because now with Pro Tools, everything is so malleable and there's so many options and so many tracks, which is really great if you need that. But we didn't have that. It hadn't been invented. So, Tom always played his acoustic guitar and sang at the same time. And he's not a loud singer. And he likes a lot of, we had real expensive mics and 1176 compressors on those vocal chain and the guitar chain, and so there's incredible amount of leakage back and forth. You couldn't do one without the other. And then he would say, like we worked on that record for a year and a half, and then one day he'd say, I got to fix that line, or I want to change the lyric here. So we'd have to match it all back up and punch in, and matching something up 6 months later in a different studio with different mics and not having anybody know that you did it.
Right. And was he playing like an acoustic while he's singing on that as well? On almost every song. I mean, some songs he did play electric on, but it's mostly acoustics. So if it's an acoustic, you got to have him play acoustic and sing and match all those mics, right?
Yeah, you match it all. It was like, anybody remember which guitar he was playing? Anybody remember? And we'd be in a different studio with different mics and different consoles, and we still have to match it up so you wouldn't be able to tell that we punched it in. And that makes a man out of you. Plus, you can't blow the punch,
right?
Because you're punching into the vocal.
Sure you can, Jim. All you got to do is once you punch, you just pull the brackets and pull it back. I don't know if you know that.
Well, you miss that punch, you pack up your backpack and you go home, and like somebody else comes in. That's how that goes.
Oh man, as that tape's rolling at 30 ips or 15 ips, whatever you're running at, and the punch is coming up, there's a different level of, it's almost like you're doing live television. It's like you're going to have a problem if you screw this up, right?
Oh, yeah. And you got to hope that he's going to be in the same vocal and guitar groove as the track you're punching into. Like if he decides to swing it a little bit or lay back a little bit, well, that's, what am I supposed to do with that? I know where I'm punching. I hope he does.
Well, and then there was this other thing where you'd be in the same exact situation. Guys punching into something. He's playing acoustic and singing. But he's not really, his pitch. He needs to hear himself the line before. So you have to put the machine on input.
Yeah.
So that he can hear himself playing and singing along, so he knows where his pitch is and he can get all that sorted out. And you have to do the punch blind because the other way is you listen until you record, and then it goes into input, and then it comes out, and you get to hear the net result. But there's a version of this where he needs to hear himself, so you have to do the punch blind.
Uh-huh.
Oh man, and this is another great point. It's like the one thing I know about you, just because of your history and looking at your studio and the records you've worked on, this dude knows how to make a decision. He doesn't have the direct guitar part to the electric guitar part. It's like you're printing all your drums on 6 tracks in some of these records.
Oh yeah, I still do, really, in a way. I mean, it's I just hate opening up a session that has 100 tracks.
Yeah,
I don't have 100 faders. Sooner or later you're going to comp things down anyway. Or you're going to come out of the same fader. I mean, just make it sound good. The quicker it sounds good and sounds like a record, that's the point. Just like make it sound. And it helps the band. Like if you get a tracking day going and it sounds great coming off the floor and you got everything going and it sounds good, when they come in for a playback and it sounds like a record, sounds like a mix almost, like wow, they're all excited. Like, well, this is going to be a great day. This is going to work. I mean, yeah, suddenly everybody's happier, but I have a much more opportunity to do that now because everyone can make their own headphone mixes and everyone can hear what they need to hear when they're out there working. But, on the Wildflowers, there was 2 headphone mixes. You could have 1 stereo headphone mix, or you could have 2 mono headphone mixes. That for everybody. So everybody had to share. And we usually ended up with 1 stereo mix. And I had to mix that too, while I was mixing the playback on the speakers for us to listen to. I was also having to mix the headphones for everybody in the band simultaneously. And they would, people would need stuff. Hey, can I have a little bit more bass? Well, everybody's going to get a little bit more bass.
Right.
Hey, can I have a little bit more hi-hat? Well, everybody's going to get a little bit more hi-hat. So it's just like but they were such a band. That was like a one thing. It was like thing. It all kind of went together at the same time. It just, they chased each other around.
And you're like at this point in your career, like you've got so many. Is there any part of you? And I know Richard Dodd did an amazing job, but is there any part of you that's like, hey man, I wish I could have mixed that record. I tracked it. You know, in the older days, it kind of people followed the record kind of through completion. And there's got to be like I'm thinking of myself, like I would want a shot maybe at mixing a record like that if I had high hopes for it.
Well, all I'll say about that is when I went back through some of these old rough mixes, just to hear them, for example, the guitars on You Wreck Me on this rough mix that I have are so loud and it's so exciting that I kind of wish that maybe the guitars were a little louder on the You Wreck Me mix, you know, but you can't, no, I don't really want to do that. I'm so grateful that I was at that spot at that moment. And it's, you know, especially since Tom passed away and he always wanted to put the whole Wildflowers record out the way we originally thought it was supposed to come out. And now it is. It just recently came out with all the other versions and in the sequence that he wanted. And you know, it's so bittersweet and sad to even keep talking about it. I just wish, you know, that's a whole nother conversation. But it's no, I don't wish I'd mixed it.
It's sort of like the universe does what the universe does.
Yeah.
And the net result is, in my opinion, one of the greatest records ever made, regardless of whether you mixed it or not.
There's only a couple of records that I engineered that I didn't mix. One of them was Robbie Robertson's first solo album, and that really broke my heart because I worked on that record passionately for a year and a half, and I really thought that I was going to mix it, and I actually had a shot to mix it, but it just wasn't good enough. So they ended up having Bob Clearmountain mix it, and you know, Bob Clearmountain is the best. And even if you only had two faders to mix in stereo, Bob would do it better than anybody. It broke my heart that he did it. But now that I listen to the record, it's such a beautiful job. And my name's still on it. And my name's associated with his. I'm really grateful for that. But that one hurt because I thought, man, I gave everything to this record. How come? And I got a shot to mix it and they didn't like it. So I kind of failed. But I really didn't. They just wanted it better. So I'm glad they did. You know, it's a cool record. And there was never a question about the Tom Petty. It was same with the Dixie Chicks that you mentioned earlier. You know, Richard and I are tied to these Grammys together because I did what I needed to do to record the albums, and then Richard would mix them. So he also not only did he mix Wildflowers, but then whatever it was, 20 years later, he mixed the big Dixie Chicks hit record.
What a record! What a record!
Yeah, and I'm glad he mixed it because I'm pretty patient and I loved the whole process. But you know, the records that I ended up mixing for Rick, which were many, it was frustrating sometimes because what I thought sounded really great would sooner or later be, you know, just moored to death, more bass, more guitar, more vocal, more compression, more top end, just push, push, push. And that's not how I hear things. I hear things much more organically and much more, just less crushed, you know, less stomped on. I know it's a great tool and I got a room full of compressors and I step on things in my own way. But there's just a line where it's better on this side than it is on that side. It's just better. And when you go over that line, whoever does it, either the mixer does it or the mastering engineer does it or whoever approves it, there's a line where it's not better. You can't turn it up as loud. It doesn't feel as good. You can't play it as often. There's just some sort of edge that happens that I personally don't want. I like things to be real and warm. And
how do you deal with that?
I
give
really,
the producer what they want, but how do you cope with like making sure that you're not exiting a product that you can't sign off on?
Well, how I do it is that I haven't really worked for any other producers in the last 15 years. I produce all the records that I work on. I mean, people call me, I haven't, except I think I did one thing with George Draculius not long ago, maybe 5 years ago or something. And George is an old friend of mine and a great guy. But nobody has enough budget to have a producer and an engineer and an assistant and a studio and all that stuff. It's just, you got to get somebody off the payroll. Like I just feel like the communication between me and my artist is better if I produce, engineer, and mix. Like, they only have to talk to me, and I only have to talk to them. It's not like, well, what do you think? Well, I don't know. Well, it's 2 against 1, or it's 4 against 3. It's like, it's myself and the artist, and we talk about it, and then we fix it, and then we're over it. We move on. It's done.
I get it. We were recently talking with somebody, and we were talking about, I think it was Andrew Sheps, and saying, at the end of the day, it's their record.
Yeah.
But there is a part of that where it's like, you got to find a way to make your vision work within their record, because I've been a part of records where I didn't do it right. And I felt like I put out something that wasn't what I wanted to put out. Like, it was below the standards of what I wanted to put out. And I was like kicking myself about it. But as I got older, I somehow figured that out, how to make sure I don't compromise myself, but make sure I'm always serving the artist. It's a delicate thing. It really takes a little bit of physics or a little bit of calculus.
You're exactly right. And how I honor that is, if I make, let's say we're near the end and I make a mix and I know that mix is done, and I print it and I go, I love that mix. That's test mix A. And I think that's the best mix ever. What do you like? And then people start tearing it apart. Well, what about the bass? Well, what about that little run? What about the end of that solo? What about details, the vocals? Is that still in tune? Is, harmony? They have earned the right to want what they want, and they get to hear the music the way they hear music. Not everybody hears music the way I do. So I don't mind making those changes, even if I feel like we're taking a few points off the board. Because at the end of the day, I got to hear what I wanted. So I'm satisfied. I did it. I created it. It's there. And, a year later, you could probably put those 2 mixes up side by side. And in a blind taste test, I might not be able to remember which was which, unless it was something obvious like, a different part or a big delay or something. You know what I mean? It's like, most of the time the requests are tiny. They're just requests. So yeah. I would not have a job if I don't have an artist. So they're right. They're always right.
Yeah.
I do my best, and most of the time they love it. But if we got to push and pull a little bit, they win. Tug of war, they win.
You're doing it right. When I looked through your discography, I kept seeing the same names over and over again. So it's like, this Tom Petty record, then that Tom Petty record, then this it's just like repeat records. And you don't survive a record unless you're able to fit in and be great, be as good as what's going on in the room. And also, not be an asshole, for lack of a better descriptor.
I take really great joy in having multiple records with those great artists. To get asked back even once is great, because they're artists. Have you ever thought about your own career? Like, how many records have you made? 300, 400, and if you look at your artists, how many records do they get to make? 2, 10, 6, like, how does that compute? Like, I can't play anything. I can't sing anything, and I get to make all the records. So I know that these artists, and it kind of hurts me a little bit when I produce a band and it's a really good record and everybody loves it, and then on their next record they go and they try somebody else. Usually it's logistics, or they moved to Nashville, or they moved, to Texas or someplace, and they're not in LA anymore. I get it. Traveling's expensive, and there's a great studio around the corner and a great guy, so go there. It's fine. But when you get asked back for the second time and the third time and the fourth time and the fifth time, it's really, really satisfying. And I think you can do better work every time. It just keeps getting better and better.
What do you think if you had a list of like maybe your favorite mix, let's say favorite total package, something you tracked, mixed, something you just mixed, whatever, preferably something you mixed because you were the last-ish person other than the mastering engineer in the chain. Is there something out there that you think is just the quintessential Jim Scott, like this is my number one?
Oh man.
Best sounding thing I did?
I have to think about that a little bit.
We'll come back to it.
Yeah, let's come back to it.
How about this? Mike started a new segment called "What's on Your Two Mix." What do you put in your two mix when you're mixing?
What is on there?
Well, I thought about that just the other day. Somebody actually wanted to come in and use my space, which the only people that I let use my space is myself and then the engineers that I work with. I have a great group of guys. And they're all like way overqualified to be running my Pro Tools rig, and patching for me, but they do. So I let them. But if somebody else wanted to come in, and I thought to myself, I'm going to have to undo some of what I do because they may not like that. So what's on my two mix is obviously it starts with the Neve 8048. And the output of that 8048 goes to a 1271 amplifier. And that's just the amplifier in the console that, actually sends it out. And that's buffered so that it goes, every place without getting loaded. So that in itself is the main sound of the console. The console itself and those 1271 amps. But on the back of those, I always have a GML. I think it's the 8200.
Yeah, the Rainbow EQ.
The Rainbow EQ. And I just have a very gentle smile. I got 3 dB at like 12K on it, and maybe a half a dB at maybe 100 cycles on it, and then maybe just a tiny little rollout. Maybe a half a dB down at 400 hertz or something. It's kind of like the kick drum sound on an API compressor, isn't it? Like little 5K, little dip at 400, little bump at 50 or 100, but just a little scoopy smile. And then I also have a pair of 2254s on the bus. So that's my chain. It's always on there.
EQ before the 2254s or after?
EQ's first.
Okay, and so the 2254s are riding on top of that EQ. And how hard do you hit that 2254 on average?
Hard, but you can't hear it. That's what's funny. They hit and then they just stay. And it's not like they pump. I mean, I probably had like 5 or 6 years where I mixed with a pair of 1176s on the bus. And you can't slow those things down enough. They're just always pumping, and it's kind of cool, but until you hear it. And then I look back at a few records where I was like, oh man, that's really going. It's really sucking and pumping. But,
so what would be a normal amount on the 2254s? 5, 10 dB?
Yeah, I would say at least 5. I mean, I honestly don't ever look at the gear. My guys look at it for me and go like, hey man, you want to take a look at this? But I don't. I can hear it when it's distorted and I can hear it when it's too slammed down. I don't want it to be so much that, the first 2 or 3 notes of a song are really loud before the compressor kicks in. When I print a mix, and if that phenomenon is happening a little bit, I'll prime the pump. I'll run the mix for 10 seconds and prime the thing, stop real quick, turn the reverbs off, start the mix so that it's in the sweet spot. Yeah, it's at least 5 dB. But it's more of a glue thing, I want things to be alive and pumping and loud and quiet, but I also like them glued together.
Right.
And that's really what the 2254s does the best.
Yeah. And those are magic compressors. I love them.
Putting a compressor on every individual thing. You know, like I will put a compressor on the bass, but and probably the lead vocal. Sometimes the acoustic guitars, but most of the time I share compressors like reverbs. I take one of my reverb sends and put it into a compressor and return that to the console someplace. And then I can put a bunch of stuff in that same compressor and just share it. Like my usual chain is I have 2 mono compressors that, come up in the middle, and then one compressor designated for the left and one compressor designated for the right. So if I've got something a little bit on the right and I want it a little bit louder, or I want to move it just a little bit, I'll just send a little to that right compressor and here it comes. Or if I want the kick drum and the snare drum and the bass and the lead vocal, just somehow a little bit like something more, I'll just keep sending them to that one of the mono compressors that comes up in the middle, and more is more. And
so explain, do you use the original signal, or are you just using is it parallel compression, or are you feeding the compressor so it's parallel?
It's all parallel compression,
Okay.
very little individual compression. Like I said, maybe on the bass, maybe on the lead vocal, but sometimes you just want even more. And I've discovered that the compressors start to sound really good when they got like 5 or 6 things in them. You know, they just, you put the kick and the snare in the same compressor, and it can turn into AC/DC pretty quickly. It's like
it's threshold cross. Yeah, there's 2 things vying for the threshold.
Yeah, and the bass and the lead vocal go good. If you put the kick drum and the bass in the same compressor, and they'll kind of tighten up a little bit in a funny kind of way. If they're, nowadays almost everything's gridded out. Not around here, but stuff that I get to mix is already gridded, which is too bad because sometimes that space is good. Sometimes it's good to have somebody just pushing and somebody pulling.
Well, I can't believe how many amazing records you've been a part of, and like seminal records. It's a real honor to have you on the program. It's just there's a certain amount of joy. Mike and I love talking to anybody that's passionate about doing it. It's a little extra special when you're talking to a guy that did a lot of records that personally affected you. So I want to thank you for coming on and being so kind. You're such a good dude. Just comes across. So thank you for doing that. And beautiful studio. Check out the studio tour that will be down in the description from this. And is there any place people can find you online, like Plyrz Studio?
Yeah, that's it. If you can get the spelling right, the Plyrz studios.com takes you to my website and get some information on how you can get in touch with me and get in touch with my manager, Gary Waldman, and kind of shows you the discography and the equipment list and the rooms. And
it's a great website, really well put together logically. So check that out. And trying to think, the 9 Days record that you worked on, I had written 3 songs on that record with those guys, and ended up doing, I think one of the songs I had produced made it on that record. But that record was such a good sound. It just sounded great. It was a pleasure to listen to that record. When you're a songwriter, you get your songs back.
You wrote some of the songs that were on the record that I did with those guys?
Yeah. I wrote 3 songs. 2, I produced one and mixed it that was added onto your record.
Yeah.
And 2 songs that you cut made it onto that record with those guys. Right. But listening back to that record, it was just like, it was super musical. I mean, it just sounded so good. So thank you for that.
Those guys John is great. John is a very talented songwriter and great singer. And I just love that they're a band and they're loyal to each other. And after all these years, they still wanted to, throw the dice. And, I'm sure they could have all kept that money for themselves and put it in some savings account, but they decided to make a record and
made a real record.
Made a real record. It's very, very wonderful.
And it feels that way. And having songs in there as a songwriter, when you get a record back and it feels that good, it's always like you're grateful, because it doesn't. I would say it's a rarity to get something back that gets cut that you're a part of as a songwriter and really be blown away. So thank you for that.
Yeah, man. Boy.
Awesome. That's it for this week on the West Barn. We'll see you next time. Signing off.